3.5 years after the wave of the protests and revolts started in the town of Ginchi by the Oromo people, the Tigray tribe-dominated government of Ethiopia was overthrown. The aim of this contribution is to explore an alternative approach to the political transition in Empire Ethiopia by examining and by comparing the experiences of other nations that transitioned from dictatorship to democracy. The belief that giving full rights to regional governments such as Oromia will result in secession, thus a strong central government is the only way to keep Empire Ethiopia united, shows a failure to understand the adverse consequences of uprooting the Oromo people from their cultural norms and preventing them from being part of the political process by letting them have a say in their own economic and political affairs. Displacement, the expropriation of their land, and the mass killing that took place since 1991 only increased the Oromians' determination to liberate Oromia from the colonial rule of Ethiopia. In order to reduce food insecurity, long-term poverty, and cultural genocide, it is important to spread power and bring lasting peace in the face of the defeatist discourses that lack demonstrable outcomes. For example, since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, several colored revolutions have taken place around the globe, and democratic institutions have deteriorated in Eastern Europe, in Africa, and Latin America. Empire Ethiopia, a country that was praised by the West as a new promise of economic development and a human rights champion, mirrored in political infighting and by land grab by outsider elites. As a result, Ethiopia has been traveling down a spiral of the poverty and the unemployment ladder. Meantime, autocratic Chinese economy has been growing in sharp contrast with gridlocked Western democracies, leaving thinkers wondering whether democracy is worth pursuing. Because large portion of Chinese population enjoyed a rising wealth and stability under autocratic Chinese rule, Western economists debate whether democracy or autocracy is better for economic growth. The hard truth, however, is that the transition from authoritarianism to democracy is notoriously difficult, no matter what. After the fall of the military government of Ethiopia, many believed that Ethiopia was going to transition towards genuine and substantive democracy characterized by resilient majority rule, free and fair election, and a strong minority and a civil right protection. But what took place was the opposite. By looking at Chinese economic growth under centralized authoritarian rule, groups that ruled Ethiopia for the past 27 years argued that economic growth will lead to democracy. To justify their argument, they cited China and Saudi Arabia, the two countries that have enjoyed economic prosperity without a commensurate increase of political freedom. Indeed, studies show that it is not economic growth but rather economic crisis that triggers regime change. Over the past 3 decades, many democratic transitions have been precipitated by serious economic shock that ruptured the authoritarian bargain. For example, the Asian financial crisis in 1997 helped Indonesia to transition into democracy. In Brazil, structural economic crisis in 1980s paved the way for its transition from military government to democracy. Mexico experienced a similar trajectory at the 1982 debt crisis that set off a political and economic change. In the Middle East, the economic shocks caused by rising food prices and the youth unemployment played a strong role, although political reforms remain stagnant. The bottom line here is that economic crisis can open the door for political change. The recent political change in Ethiopia, for example, and the anticipation of the 2018 political momentum is the result of the political upheaval that forced the TPLF-dominated Ethiopian government of 25 years absolute rule. In addition to economic crisis, there are other forces that are responsible for changes. For example, as much as flawed elections were denounced as meaningless attempts to dress authoritarian rule in the trappings of democracy, even such elections can sow the seed of public expectation that over time blossom into democratic demands. The fake elections that the TPLF staged and always won offered the unintended consequences that resulted in the international community rejecting the regime as much as it increased people's expectation for better election to be held next time. That means holding even fake election can help countries ruled by dictators to transition to democratic government, especially if the multi-party electoral competition are allowed. Armed rebellion backed by non-violent movement can also lead to mass mobilization, which may result in the birth of democratic process. What must be clear here is that armed rebellions often failed to lead to democratization, as seen in case of the TPLF and others that littered history. Failed uprisings, coup d'etats, and the violent revolutions that succeeded always replaced one form of dictatorship with another. Non-violent mass mobilizations, on the other hand, have a stronger track record of laying the groundwork for democratic change. The proponents of non-violence, from Gandhi to Martin Luther King, have long noted that sustained peaceful protests lead to a more engaged citizenry and a better organized civil society, critical for staying the course during the inevitable challenges of democratic transitions. For example, Poland's trade union federation political movement that held a quarter of the population of the country was instrumental in Poland's transition to democracy. Similarly, South Africa's broad-based grassroots liberation movements supported by armed struggle produced a strong civil society engagement, which also resulted in helping the country to transition from minority rule to majority rule. Indonesia's widespread street protest in 1997 and 1998 resulted in a high vote turnout in 1999 and made ordinary Indonesians owners of their own democratization process. Namibia and El Salvador have overcome violent beginnings to evolve along the path of democracy. In contrast, however, Ukrainians' mass revolt of 2004 that involved hundreds of thousands of protesters who filled the streets of Kyiv failed because of the movement lacked the depth and vibrancy of genuine grassroots movement. Well, the Nigerians also tried to transition their government from dictatorship to democracy, but they failed because the movement wasn't grounded in a broad-based popular movement. As seen in the Arab Spring case, some dictatorship requires violence to be removed from power because they are determined to fight their own people. For example, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, al-Bashir of Syria are a good example for that. Looking at Ethiopia's current regime through the reality of just that I described above, I can only recommend that the Oromo mass must press forward with caution, resisting the great temptation of favorite deals that may be offered to those who are involved in mass mobilization projects. By resisting the acceptance of political positions or bribes, it is possible to nurture civil society building through civic exchange, and support for local civil society organizations. Support for independent media is also a crucial aid to promote democracy. These are generally low-cost, high-return investments. In reality, therefore, the promise which the current regime has made when it comes to allowing, by current regime I'm meaning the Ethiopian government led by Abiy Ahmed, has made promises when it comes to allowing political freedom, that is already raised people's expectation for transitioning to true democracy, economic and social opportunities. The success of the government that is going to be formed after 2 or 3 years depends on whether democracy can also improve people's life. When people see improvements in social inclusion and living standards, they reward the politicians and they create a powerful feedback loop that helps to consolidate power, democracy. On the other hand, if unemployment skyrockets, for example, or if the rich just seem to get richer while nothing changes for the masses, a return to autocracy can begin to look a new reality again. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Brazil's President Cardoso and then Lula da Silva unleashed new talent and investment through anti-inflationary, anti-monopoly economic reforms, while simultaneously increasing social spending on the poor and the middle class. To do that, they used two main strategies. First, they used the conditional cash transfer that efficiently targeted the neediest while encouraging positive behavior such as keeping kids in school. Second, they used universal provision of social and economic rights such as healthcare, education, and labor protections to include the disadvantaged group. Similarly, Mexico consolidated democracy by delivering the economic opportunity for broader cross-section citizenship or citizenry. In Ethiopia's case, the EPRDF regime failed to meet people's expectation, making Empire Ethiopia the breeding ground for exclusion, where benefiting foreign investors and the domestic elites at the expense of the mass was a regular practice. Doing so, however, resulted in a widespread resentment that prompted a coup d'etat-like revolt that brought the current or the Abiy regime to power. At this point, mass expectations are high. People are impatient. So identifying reforms that can immediately improve people's life without depending on unsustainable economic policies in the longer term is critical. The specific policy options available in any country are always context specific. What worked in Poland probably won't work for Empire Ethiopia, but a few things can apply. Restructuring government structures and expanding the social safety net to improve the lives of the poor can make the mass supportive of the new government. For example, putting Finfinne under Oromia, making Afan Oromo a working language, can make transition not only smooth but democratic. Redirecting funds that are collected from Oromia but has been captured by the special interest groups can be a tangible accomplishment. In this vein, one important step is elimination of expensive and inefficient subsidies to Tigray state that imposed significant cost on Oromia's budgets and distort investment incentives and economic growth. Such subsidies should be replaced by targeted cash transfer to the communities that got hurt the most by violence, displacement, and dislocation, and the eastern and southern Oromia are good candidates for that. Power transfer from the so-called federal government to the states such as Oromia can also play a vital role in creating shared opportunity by enabling states to invest in the federal government. Giving the states the right to design their own economic policies would make each state feel sovereign. In other words, people will stop asking whether or not they believe in this new government if they are left alone to elect whoever they want at local and regional levels. If these things are not done, the existing shaky government will not be able to show citizens that it can protect their core rights and establish fair economic and political rule. If people believe that legal system and public institutions work for them rather than against them, it gives them a stake in the system and a greater willingness to tolerate the inevitable turbulence of the transition. An effective, transparent, and predictable legal system also prevents well-connected insiders from amassing wealth and the public assets through shady background deals, like we've seen in the past. Today, Poland is a paragon of inclusive democracy and a market economy built from the ashes of an oppressive state. Its success can in part be attributed to the fact that structural economic reforms, particularly the privatization of state-owned assets, occurred only after policymakers had put in place a legal system that leveled the playfield and established strong safeguards against corruption. In contrast, Ukraine has failed to establish a fair and impartial legal system. Without equality before the law, predictability and the legal enforcement, or any meaningful mechanisms of transparency, the vast majority of Ukrainians' newly privatized wealth ended up in the hands of oligarchies by the late 1990s. Hence, the most important thing is that leaders of Empire Ethiopia can do at this time is to implement strong rule of law reforms, especially those that can be implemented in the near terms and are hard to reverse. The establishment of the transparent auctions to privatize public assets is crucial. So too is the reform of laws constraining civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations such as NGO. Building the capacity of the judiciary, parliament, and the civil society to implement the rule of law reforms takes time, but the spread of information technology can allow average citizens to play a bigger role in combating corruption and bolstering the law through the public dissemination. Empowering local and regions help dilute the dangerous concentration of central authority often inherited from the authoritarian regimes of the TPLF. It also increases accountability by bringing administration closer to the people. For example, Indonesia benefited from the devaluation of power by distributing power to the local and regional government in order to maintain national unity in the face of the growing separatist demands. After the failed economic and political centralization of the communist government, Poland made a priority of establishing local self-governance. By the late 1990s, a series of reforms gave local communities control over almost half of Poland's budget. Spreading out power also had a positive impact in Poland. Decentralization of power, of course, is not a universal cure. It requires effective local government structure. The leader of Empire Ethiopia should therefore decentralize thoughtfully in ways that help deepening and sustaining democratization. The multilateral development banks have a strong role to play as well. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the difficult challenge of transforming oppressive states into free and open societies. History has made fools of those who believed that they could determine the fate of a nation by following a playbook. But these insights can serve as valuable guideposts on the long and difficult road to democratic transition. Thank you.